You did well marrying up like that. My father said it into a microphone, in front of 120 people. There was a pause right after. Not silence, just that shift in the room when people were trying to decide if something was meant as a joke. He smiled, even laughed a little. Let's be honest, he added, glancing at Emma. She could have done a lot better. But somehow he convinced her. A few people chuckled. Not many. I looked at Emma. She was still smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes anymore. I picked up my glass, took a sip, and said nothing. Not then. Not later. I let the moment pass like it didn't matter. But I remembered every word. And 3 years later, he called me and said something else I didn't forget. That's where this really starts. Before I get to that phone call and what he asked for, you need to understand what led up to it. Because none of it started in that moment. It started much earlier in ways that didn't look important at the time. I grew up in a house where nothing was ever said directly. Not in a loud way. Not in a way anyone else would notice. Just quietly, in small sentences that stayed with you longer than they should. My father wasn't difficult by most standards. He worked consistently, paid for what needed to be paid for, showed up when people expected him to show up. If you met him once, you would probably describe him as steady, reliable even. But living with him was different. He had a way of placing you somewhere without ever saying it outright. When I was 17, I got accepted into a decent university. Nothing elite, but strong enough. I remember handing him the letter at the kitchen table. He read it once, then said, "That's a good fit for you." Not congratulations. Not pride. Just a good fit. At the time, I didn't question it. It sounded reasonable. It was only later I realized what he meant, that it matched exactly where he thought I belonged. Not higher, not lower. Exactly there. And that pattern didn't change. When I got my first job at 23, entry level, basic salary, long hours, he said, that's the kind of place you can grow slowly. When I moved to a better role 2 years later, with a noticeable salary increase, he said, just make sure you don't get ahead of yourself. Always measured. Always slightly limiting. Never enough to argue with. But always enough to feel. So I stopped reacting. Somewhere in my mid-20s, I understood something clearly. There was no version of my life where he would look at me and see more than he had already decided. And once I accepted that, things got quieter. I focused on my own work. I built my career step by step. Nothing dramatic. No sudden leaps. Just consistency. Long hours when needed. Learning when others stopped paying attention. Taking roles that gave me more responsibility, even if they didn't immediately pay more. By the time I was 29, I had moved through 3 companies. My income had more than doubled since I started. Not extraordinary, but stable. Comfortable. More importantly, it was mine. I didn't talk about it much at home. There wasn't much to say that would change anything. Around that same time, I met Emma. It was a Tuesday evening, around 7:30 p.m. A colleague had invited a few of us out after work to a small place near the office. Nothing special, just a corner restaurant with slow service and decent food. Emma was there because she had just joined their team the week before. We ended up sitting across from each other, mostly because there were no other seats. The conversation was normal at first. Work, the city, why everyone complains about the commute but never actually changes it. At one point, she looked at me for a second and said, "You don't seem surprised by anything." I asked, "Is that a bad thing?" She shook her head slightly. "No, it just means you've already adjusted your expectations." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "That's probably accurate." She smiled, not in a polite way, more like she recognized it. We kept talking after that. Nothing rushed. No pressure. We saw each other again a few days later, then the week after. It built slowly. And what stood out about Emma wasn't anything dramatic. It was the absence of confusion. If she thought something, she said it. If she felt something, she didn't hide it behind something else. There was no second meaning to figure out. At first, that felt unfamiliar. I would catch myself waiting, expecting there to be something underneath what she said. But there wasn't. And over time, that changed how I spoke too. I became more direct. less careful about how things might be interpreted. Because with her, they weren't. About a year later, I introduced her to my father. We met on a Sunday afternoon, around 1 p.m., a quiet restaurant, the kind he prefers. Not crowded, not loud. He was polite, asked her about her work, her background. She answered clearly, calmly. At one point, he said, "You've done well for yourself." She said, "I've had good opportunities." He nodded, then glanced at me for just a second. "Opportunities matter," he said. Then he looked back at her. It was subtle, almost nothing, but I understood it. Emma did too. She didn't react, just continued the conversation. Later that evening, when we were back at her place, she asked me, "Has he always been like that?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." She nodded, didn't try to analyze it, didn't try to fix it. She just accepted it as part of the situation. That mattered more than I expected. 6 months later, we got engaged. No big moment, just the two of us sitting in her living room after dinner. I had the ring in my pocket for almost 2 hours before I said anything. When I finally asked, she didn't pause, just said yes, like it was already decided. We started planning the wedding after that. Took our time with it. We agreed early on we wanted something simple but complete. Around 120 guests, close friends, family, a few colleagues. Nothing excessive, but not small. My father was involved in the way he always was. He asked questions, offered suggestions, never took ownership of anything. At one point, while we were reviewing the guest list at my apartment, he said, "You've brought together quite a mix of people." I asked, "What do you mean?" He leaned back slightly. Different levels, different backgrounds. I knew exactly what he meant. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything useful to say. I had learned that engaging with those kinds of comments didn't change them. It just extended them. And I wasn't interested in extending anything. Because at that point, my focus was somewhere else. I was building something that felt clear. A relationship that didn't require interpretation. A life that didn't depend on someone else's opinion of it. If you've ever reached that point where you stop trying to be seen a certain way and start living in a way that doesn't need that approval, then you already understand how quiet that shift is. It doesn't feel dramatic. It just feels settled. And if that's something you recognize in your own life, then you should stay with me. Subscribe to Where Silence Ends. Because every story here lives in that space between what was expected of you and what you chose instead. And before I continue, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had someone in your life who never said anything outright, but still made you feel smaller over time? If you have, drop in the comments. You're not alone in that. Now, the wedding was scheduled for early June. A Saturday, clear weather, warm but comfortable. The kind of day where everything feels under control before anything actually happens. The ceremony went exactly as planned. Short, simple. Emma was calm the entire time. Not nervous, just present. I remember standing there thinking, this feels right. Not overwhelming, not uncertain, just clear. After the ceremony, we moved into the reception. People relaxed. Conversation started. Music in the background. It felt steady, exactly the way we wanted it. During dinner, I noticed my father speaking with one of the staff near the side of the room. He pointed toward the microphone stand in the center. The staff member nodded. I assumed it was for speeches. That was normal. A few minutes later, I saw him walking toward it. Unhurried, confident, like he had already decided something. And for a moment, I felt something shift. Not alarm, just awareness. I watched as he adjusted the microphone slightly, tapped it once, and looked out across the room. That's when I realized this wasn't part of the plan. At first, it didn't register as unusual. Weddings have speeches. People stand up, say things they rehearsed or didn't. So when my father picked up the microphone, I assumed it would be something expected. A few words, a short story, maybe something about family. He cleared his throat once, looked around the room, then started. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," he said. A few people smiled, but I felt like I should say something as his father. He gestured toward me briefly. I nodded, just acknowledging it. He continued, "I've known him his entire life, he said. Obviously, a few light laughs. And if there's one thing I've always tried to do, it's keep his expectations realistic. That landed slightly off. Not enough to stop the room, but enough to shift it. He looked at Emma. And Emma, you've done very well for yourself. A few claps. Emma smiled politely. Then he paused, just long enough to make the next sentence feel deliberate. I mean that sincerely, he added. Because, let's be honest, he glanced back at me. He's had a way of landing on his feet. A few scattered laughs. Not many. And in this case, he said, he's managed to marry above his station. That was the phrase. Above his station. It stayed in the air for a second. People adjusted in their seats, small movements, quiet reactions. Emma didn't move. Her smile held, but it changed. My father gave a light laugh into the microphone. I'm joking, of course, he said. Mostly. That word. Mostly. He continued for another minute. Stories that weren't really stories. Observations that sounded harmless, but leaned in one direction. How I had always been steady, but not exceptional. How Emma brought a level of polish that I never really had. Each sentence placed carefully. Each one just far enough from direct to avoid being challenged. When he finished, there was applause. Polite. Measured. He handed the microphone back, returned to his seat, and picked up his glass. Like nothing had happened. I sat there for a second, then picked up my own glass, took a sip, and said nothing. Emma leaned slightly toward me. Are you okay? She asked quietly. I nodded. Yes. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded too. We didn't talk about it there. Not at the table. Not during the rest of the reception. We moved through the evening the way it was expected. Spoke to guests. Smiled when needed. Let the moment pass without expanding it. If anyone noticed, it didn't say anything. And that was fine, because I wasn't interested in making it bigger in front of everyone else. By around 11:15 p.m., most of the room had cleared. We said our goodbyes. My father shook my hand. Good event, he said. I nodded. Yeah. He looked at Emma. You handled it well. She smiled politely. Thank you. Then he left. No acknowledgement. No follow-up. Nothing. We got back to the hotel just after midnight. The room was quiet. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, took off her shoes, and looked at me. That wasn't a joke, she said. I sat across from her. No. She held my gaze. Has he always done that? Yes. A small pause. Why didn't you say anything, she asked. I thought about it, then said, because it wouldn't change anything. She nodded slowly. I understand that, she said. But that doesn't mean it's okay. I know. There was a quiet moment between us. Then she said something that stayed with me. You don't have to prove anything to him, but you also don't have to keep accepting it. I didn't answer right away, because she was right. Not in a dramatic way, just clearly. We didn't talk about it much after that. Not that night. Not the next day. We left for our honeymoon a week later. 10 days away. No calls. No messages. Just distance. And in that distance, something settled. I wasn't avoiding a confrontation because I didn't know what to say. I was avoiding it because I already knew the outcome. Nothing would change. Not his perspective. Not his tone. Not the way he saw me. So when we got back, I made one adjustment. I stopped initiating contact. I still answered when he called. Still responded when he asked something directly. But I didn't offer anything more. Less detail. Shorter responses. No updates unless he asked. And over time, the space grew. Quietly. Consistently. By the end of that first year, the relationship had reduced itself to something very specific. Occasional calls. Short conversations. No real involvement. And I was fine with that. Emma was fine with that too. We built our life without factoring him into it. That following spring, we took a trip to Lisbon. 10 days. No work. No interruptions. I remember sitting at a small cafe near the river around 10:30 in the morning, just watching people move through their day. Emma looked at me and said, "You seem lighter." I asked, "What do you mean?" She smiled. Less guarded. I thought about that, then said, "I think I stopped waiting for something that wasn't coming." She reached across the table, rested her hand on mine, and nodded. That was the first time I said it out loud. And once I said it, it stayed. The distance didn't feel like loss. It felt like alignment, and I thought that was the end of it, that things would just continue that way. But about a year later, small details started to change. Things I didn't notice right away, until they became impossible to ignore. Because the man who once spoke with certainty was starting to sound like he was running out of options. About a year later, it came up casually. I was at a family gathering, nothing formal. Just a Sunday afternoon at my aunt's place. Around 2 p.m., people moving between the kitchen and the living room. Conversations overlapping. My aunt pulled me aside near the hallway. She said, "Your father's been making some changes." I asked, "What kind of changes?" She hesitated. "Financial," she said. Nothing serious. But the way she said it suggested otherwise. I didn't press. There wasn't much to gain from it. A few weeks later, during one of our short phone calls, he mentioned something himself. "I'm thinking of downsizing," he said. I asked from the house. "Yes." "Why?" "Just practical." The answer came too quickly, too clean. I let it go, because I already knew how these conversations worked. If he wanted to explain something, he would. If he didn't, asking wouldn't change that. Over the next few months, more details surfaced, always indirectly. The house had been sold. He had moved into a smaller place. Something about an investment that didn't go as planned. Nothing described as a problem, just adjustments. But the pattern underneath, it was clear. Things were shifting, and the way he talked about it hadn't changed. Still measured, still minimizing, reducing everything to something manageable, even when it clearly wasn't. I recognized it immediately. It was the same tone he had always used with me, the same way he used to frame things, as if saying less made it smaller, as if keeping it controlled made it stable. But this time, it wasn't working. By the beginning of the third year, the situation was more visible. He had moved again. Temporary, he said. Still no clear long-term plan. Still no direct explanation. And still, no change in how he spoke to me. Not once did he reference the wedding. Not once did he revisit anything he had said. It was as if that moment had never happened. But I remembered it. Clearly. Every word. Every pause. And that one word in particular. Mostly. The way he said it, like it softened everything that came before. Like it turned something deliberate into something harmless. I thought about that more than I expected to. Not with emotion. Just as a reference point. A clear example of how he saw things. And how he expected them to be received. By the middle of that third year, the calls became more frequent. Still short. Still controlled. But different. There was hesitation now. Small pauses where there hadn't been any before. At one point, he asked about my work. Not in the usual way. Not a surface question followed by a short response. He asked, "What exactly are you doing now?" I explained it. He listened, then said, "That sounds stable." That word stood out. Stable. It wasn't something he used before. Not with me. I just said, "It is." There was a pause. Then the conversation moved on. But something had shifted. A few days later, he called again. Around 7:20 p.m. This time, he mentioned his living situation more directly. "I might need to make another move," he said. I asked where to. "Not sure yet." That was new. For the first time, there was no clear direction. No controlled outcome. Just uncertainty. I didn't react. Just said, "All right." After that call, Emma and I talked about it more directly. We were in the living room. Late evening, around 10:30 p.m. She said, "He's getting closer to asking for something." I looked at her. "You think so?" "Yes." I thought about it. It made sense. The increase in contact. The change in tone. The references to instability. All of it pointed in one direction. I asked, "What do you think I should do?" She leaned back slightly, then said, "Decide before he asks." That stayed with me, because she was right. If I waited until the moment, I would be reacting, and reacting always comes with pressure. But if I decided in advance, it would just be a decision. So that night, I thought about it, not emotionally, just clearly, what the relationship had been, what was now, and what I was willing to allow. I didn't need to predict what he would say. I already knew enough. And once I accepted that, the answer became simple. I decided where the line was, quietly, without discussion, without needing to justify it. And once it was set, there was nothing left to figure out. I just didn't know exactly when he would cross it, or how directly he would ask. But a few nights later, my phone rang, and I saw his name on the screen. And this time, the call didn't feel routine anymore. I answered the call and stepped out onto the balcony, closed the door behind me. The city was quieter at that hour, just a low hum in the background. "Hey," I said. There was a pause, longer than usual. Then he said, "I need to talk to you about something. Not casual, not routine, direct." I leaned slightly against the railing. "Go ahead." Another pause. Then he started. "I've had to make some changes recently," he said. Measured, controlled. The same tone, just with less certainty behind it. "I sold the place," he continued. "That part you already know." "Yes. And the smaller place, that's not going to work long term." I asked why not. It was always temporary. That wasn't new information. But it was the first time he said it without framing it as a plan. More like a situation he was now inside. "There were some financial decisions that didn't go as planned," he added. He didn't go into detail. He didn't need to. I already understood enough. Then there was another pause, long enough to make the next part feel deliberate. "I'm looking for a place to stay for a while," he said. I didn't respond immediately. Just let it sit. Then I asked, "Where are you thinking?" There was a slight shift in his voice. "I was thinking with you. Not fully stated yet. Just placed into the conversation." Then he clarified, "You and Emma have space." That was the first time he mentioned her directly in this context. Not as my partner, not as family, as part of the apartment, part of what made the request possible. "And it makes sense," he added. "Family helps family." That phrase landed clean. Prepared. Used before. I stayed quiet. Then asked, "Who's we?" A small hesitation. "Me and Diane," he said. Diane. He had mentioned her briefly over the past year. Always in passing. But I knew enough. She had moved in with him about 8 months earlier, after leaving her own apartment. We're part-time at a small office, something administrative. And from what little he had shared, she relied on him more than he relied on her. So this wasn't just about him needing space. It was about bringing both of them into ours. I nodded slightly, even though he couldn't see it. "How long?" I asked. "A few months," he said. 3, maybe 4. Then, more firmly, "I'll contribute. I'm not asking to stay for free." I let the conversation pause. Not because I needed more information, but because I already had everything I needed. The request, the expectation, the assumption that this was reasonable. And in that moment, everything aligned. The wedding, the speech, the word mostly, the 3 years of distance. The way the relationship had already reshaped itself into something minimal. And now, this, a request to step fully into a life he had never really respected. Not directly, but consistently. I said his name once, then spoke. "I can't do that." There was no hesitation, no shift in tone, just direct. On the other end, silence. "Then what do you mean?" "I mean, I'm not able to have you stay here." Another pause, longer this time. "This is temporary," he said. "I understand. You have the space. That's not the issue." Silence again. Then more control. "This is family." "I know, and I meant that." There was no anger behind it, no frustration, just clarity. Then he asked why not. Not aggressive, not emotional, just direct. And that was the moment everything narrowed down to something simple. Not the history, not the speech, not the years of distance, just the present. I had already made the decision, so I gave him the answer that matched it. Because it doesn't work for me. Nothing added, nothing explained, just the boundary. And in that moment, the conversation stopped being a discussion. It became something final, because there wasn't anything left to negotiate. And for the first time, he understood that this wasn't something he could adjust with a different tone or a different explanation. But the answer wasn't going to change. And that realization sat there between us, before either of us said anything else. He didn't respond right away. And in that silence, I could feel something shift. Not tension, not conflict, Just recognition. Then he said, I see. Short. Controlled. Back to the tone he understood. I'll figure something out, he added. I'm sure you will, I said. There was a pause, like he was considering whether to say something else. Then, it would have made things easier, he said. I didn't respond to that, because it wasn't really a statement. It was a way of leaving something behind in the conversation. A small attempt to reframe it. I'll let it pass. He exhaled slightly, then said, all right. And just like that, it started to close. No argument. No escalation. Just a shift. He had asked. I had answered. And that was it. We ended the call less than a minute later. No drawn-out ending. No forced resolution. Just done. I stood there on the balcony for a few seconds after the line disconnected. The city was quiet. Nothing had changed outside, but something had settled internally. Not relief. Not tension. Just alignment. I went back inside. Emma looked up at me from the couch. It happened, she asked. Yes. And I said no. She nodded once. Okay. No follow-up. No analysis. Because there wasn't anything to figure out. We had already done that part. We sat there for a few minutes in silence. Then she asked, how do you feel? I thought about it. Then said, clear. And that was the most accurate word. Because the moment itself wasn't complicated. The complexity had already been resolved before the call even happened. All that was left was the decision. And the decision had been simple. Outside of that, everything else just followed. I didn't know what he would do next. Didn't try to predict it. Because for the first time, it didn't matter. The boundary was already in place. And it wasn't going to move. We ended the call less than a minute after that. No goodbye that meant anything. Just a quiet, all right, on both sides, and then the line disconnected. I stood on the balcony for a few seconds longer. The air felt still. Not heavy, not tense, just still. Then I went back inside. Emma was sitting on the couch, watching me without asking anything yet. I sat down across from her. It happened, I said. She nodded once. And I said no. She held my gaze for a second, then leaned back slightly. Okay, that was it. No follow-up questions. No need to analyze it, because we had already talked about it, already understood what it meant. We sat there for a few minutes in silence. Then she said, how do you feel? I thought about it. Not quickly. Actually took a moment. Then I said, clear. And that was the most accurate word for it. Not relieved. Not proud. Not conflicted. Just clear. Like something that had been unsettled for a long time had finally reached its natural position. Over the next few days, I didn't hear from him. No messages. No calls. Which wasn't unusual. Silence had always been part of how he handled things. So I didn't expect anything different. A week later, my aunt called. We spoke for a few minutes. Then she mentioned him. He's looking at some temporary places, she said. I said, that's good. She hesitated slightly, then added, he seemed surprised. I understood what she meant. Not surprised by the situation. Surprised by my response. I just said, he'll figure it out. She didn't push, because there wasn't anything else to say. A few days after that, he sent a short message. Found a place for now. Sorted. No details. No explanation. No reference to the call. I replied, glad to hear it. And that was it. The conversation ended there. Weeks passed. Then months. The contact returned to what it had been before. Occasional. Surface level. Controlled. But something had changed. Not in how often we spoke, but in how the silence between those conversations felt. Before, there was always something underneath it. An unfinished thought. A question that never quite resolved. Now, there was nothing. No expectation. No waiting. Just distance that made sense. Emma noticed it first. One evening, we were having dinner, around 8 p.m., just the two of us. She said, you don't seem affected by him anymore. I looked at her. I think I just stopped trying to maintain something that wasn't there. She nodded slowly. That a big shift. It doesn't feel big, I said. It usually doesn't, she replied. And she was right. It didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel like a turning point. It just felt settled. About 6 months later, we had a small gathering at our place. A few close friends. Nothing formal. At one point, Someone asked how long we had been married. 3 years, Emma said. I nodded. Just over. The conversation moved on quickly. But for a moment, I thought about that number. 3 years. 3 years since that speech. 3 years since that moment in a room full of people where something that had always been private became public. And I realized something. That moment didn't change me. It revealed something I had already been living with. What changed me was what I did after. Or more specifically, what I stopped doing. I stopped trying to correct something that had never been open to correction. I stopped expecting a different version of someone who had already shown me who they were. And once I stopped, everything else aligned around that decision. The distance wasn't a loss. It was an adjustment, a necessary one. And the boundary I set didn't cost me anything I actually needed. If anything, it gave me something back. Clarity, space, and a version of my life that wasn't shaped by someone else's quiet limitations. I still speak to him. Occasionally. It's polite, brief, exactly what it needs to be. Nothing more, nothing less. And that's enough. Because not every relationship needs to be repaired. Some just need to be understood and left where they are. If there's one thing I took from all of this, it's simple. You don't need a confrontation to create a boundary. Sometimes you just need to decide where you stand and stay there. If stories like this speak to you, subscribe to Where Silence Ends. Because every story here is about that moment when something quiet finally becomes clear. And before you go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to say no to someone you were always expected to say yes to? If you have, tell me in the comments. You might find more people understand that than you expect. There's another story I want to share with you soon. Because sometimes the things we stay silent about the longest are the ones that shape us the most.